In our first episode, we discussed behavioral leadership from the perspective of corporations and other for profit entities. In this episode, we'll do a deep dive into the unique leadership challenges facing nonprofit and faith based organizations. We cover the volunteer dynamic, the paradox of time as we cast a vision, ways of navigating metrics, divisiveness, and more on today's Theory to Thriving podcast. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Theory to Thriving podcast. I'm Jesse Innes, and joining me is my co-host, Dave Zetlow. Thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate you listening wherever you may be. Please also like and subscribe. You can find our podcast on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and theorytothriving.com. You can also find our blog on Substack and LinkedIn. We'd love to include you in the conversation, so leave us a comment or join us in our free-to-join Discord. Until then, let's hop into today's conversation. So here's what you can expect from Theory to Thriving.
We will be reading two articles that will be centered on the theory that we talked about during our podcast, and also give you some more detail. There will also be a case study, which we really think will promote conversation, both by the group and the community that we develop, but also your workplace. It's interesting, very to the point, and really talks about moving theory really to reality. How do you do it with on the ground?
Yeah. And so we recognize that we want to move from theory to thriving. And so we have a lot of different ways for you to interact with that. There's the blogs, as Dave just mentioned, but there's the conversation that you're listening to right now. And we're going to break those conversations up. And so there's going to be a blog that is much more general to leadership. And then there's going to be a blog that's much more niche to nonprofits and faith-based communities. And there's also going to be conversations that are much more broad in leadership and much more niche to nonprofit and faith-based teams and organizations. And from there, we encourage you to continue the conversation with us. So you'll be able to find our website, our Discord channel, and our social media platforms to continue the conversation with us. And so we hope that you are along with us for this journey. We're excited. We hope you're excited, and we hope to hear from you soon.
We are also lifelong learners, so we will take your information, your ideas, we'll debate them, we'll bring them on, we'll change our and build on our thoughts currently. So we expect this to be a growing experience for us as well. Like I said, we're just lifelong learners like you are.
Absolutely. And so we're looking forward to hear from you and maybe even have you on the podcast at some point. So I think one of the things that kind of stood out to me from our previous conversation is the idea that that a lot of these theories are individual parts of a larger system, a lot of things that leaders have to take into consideration. It's not just about the theory. It's not just about putting that theory into practice. We have to also take our teams as human beings and everything that comes with being a human being. So that's one of the things I think that really stood out to me in the conversation. I would say for behavioral theory specifically, the thing that stood out to me in the conversation is that behavioral theory came out of this idea that it's not just about these heroes who are born with these traits to be leaders. It's about the idea that everyone has that opportunity, and if we can discover what needs to be learned, and we discover the habits and the behaviors that need to be developed, then other people can participate and can grow into becoming leaders as well. But unfortunately, what comes with that is that those it can lead to this checklist of actions that that leave a trap for folks. Folks end up in a situation where they are participating in this monotonous activity where they over time forget why they were doing this to begin with, and with everything else that's going on in life, they start to feel like they don't even really want to participate in it anymore. And so, what are we going to do when that starts to happen? How can we begin to identify that trap, but be dynamic enough to address those issues and all the other issues that's coming up in a person's life? Is that feel like that's a good summary of the conversation we had earlier? Am I missing anything?
I think it's wonderful, Jesse. And the fact of the matter is, between your learnings and the learnings of the people that watched this last week, it's been a wonderful start to the discussion. And I'm really wondering now if we can narrow down in this second podcast and be more specific in an area.
Yeah.
One of the areas that we might want to be more specific in is this idea of nonprofits, faith-based organizations, and how this behavioral theory might apply to that, the leadership in those areas where there isn't as much study, but there is a strong need. You're basically have a lot of experience in those areas. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so my thoughts, I think, you know, a lot of folks, a lot of leaders in faith-based spaces and nonprofit spaces as well, we are not just looking at individuals who work for us. We're not just looking at staff. We're also looking at a volunteer base as well. And so it's sometimes that volunteer base is the same size as our staff. Sometimes that volunteer base is much, much bigger. And so we need to kind of look at these principles in a new way. And I think so. For example, with the behavioral theory, um, what could happen when you fall into that trap of just being in this monotonous checklist is you might have volunteers who decide I don't want to do that anymore, and they're not they're not being paid. They would love to use their time in ways that that they feel like is important, and so some they might decide to move on to something else. And they decide to move on to something else for a lot of different reasons, not just because of the culture of the community that you're building, but that could be a factor. And sometimes volunteers will let you know why they aren't coming back. A lot of times they won't let you know why they're not coming back. And so I think that there's an added complexity when you're dealing with a volunteer base who um who really don't owe you any explanation as to why they'll participate or not participate, right? And so I think that is probably one of the number one um added layers to consider from a nonprofit or faith-based perspective, is that we're dealing with a volunteer base who more likely than not, are not going to be there forever, and that does change the dynamic of the team. But Dave, you have some experience, a lot of experience in that realm as well. Is there anything else that you feel like folks could be um, encountering as leaders in that space?
Well, I really enjoyed your talk. My last 15 years, I've had most of my consulting business on this idea of how do you improve the effectiveness of faith-based organizations and nonprofits. I agree with you on the volunteers. It's interesting from my experience where you also run into a problem is on the leaders themselves.
Mm,
Oftentimes, they're passionate about the idea, they want to follow God. They want to be a Peter. They want to be a disciple. They really believe that people should be clothed. They really believe that it's important to get education in the schools. They're strongly motivated. And yet, that strong motivation, a lot of times, is very narrowing. And I don't mean in a bad way, but it's very narrowing. They're passionate and really learning leadership skills is daunting to them.
Mm,
How to manage people. And then, as you say, complicating that is they have to have volunteers. So they've got to be a recruiter. Oftentimes, they're a one person band, right? They basically have themselves and two other leaders. For a lot of times, I used to try to help them to gain a triangle of leadership, right? So, one of the aspects that we might want to talk about is how would you approach that? Well, behaviorally, one of the things in the checklist is find out what you're good at. So, first off, the passionate leader, they're the ones that should articulate a vision, right? So, you help them
mm,
articulate the vision that not only is translatable from their heart mission, but other people can grab onto, right? So you've
mhm,
got to give them that skill set. And that's one of the ways behavioral thriller really helps is it says, hey, we need you to be able to articulate a vision, right?
mhm.
Second thing that's important, and you mentioned it already, is how do you recruit and retain volunteers? A lot of time that's very hard. The
Yeah.
person that, so either you select another person, you recognizing you can't do it, or you learn those skills. And the third skill, interestingly enough, that I found for a leader on this checklist of behaviors, they have to also be able to deal with finances. Um,
Mhm.
and that sometimes that's the last thing from their mind. I mean, they've been called, they've been motivated, they've seen a problem in society, they want to fix the problem. They don't care about money. The challenge is they need money. And, if they need paid staff to manage volunteers, need supplies, those things all come out. So I think that's one of the really challenging things about the idea of nonprofits and faith-based. What do you think about that? Do you think part it's not only the volunteers but also the leader skills?
Yeah. Yeah, so I would say, spot on all of that. I think for a lot of the leaders, a lot of our leaders, we're coming from a space where we are very excited and we feel called, like you said. But sometimes going through this behavioral checklist of things that we need leads us to feel like the progress is just too slow. Um, we see a great need. We see a lot of times we might have relationships with those people who have those great needs, and we want to be the change, right? We want to see that change in the world. But a lot of these things that you've mentioned, like building the right volunteer base and dealing with finances, it always feels like those things are getting in the way. There's a running joke among pastors of things that we don't learn in seminary. Well, you just listed three of those really big things that you don't learn in seminary. You don't learn unless you. I'm assuming unless you take like a really specific class that's off your specific journey of becoming of receiving like a master's in divinity or something like that or a certificate, you aren't really exposed to budgeting and you know budgeting and fundraising and things like that. You're not really exposed to that. And so to your point, either you have a volunteer or you have a staff person who is really good at that, or you have to get really good at that too. And you might not have the resources nor the time, or you might feel like you don't have the time to pursue that. And so I think for a lot of leaders, it is just this it is just this idea of like wanting to maintain that passion within yourself while dealing with a lot of things that you might not have gotten into this to pursue and or feel like you're even gifted in that area at all. Um, like you said, we need money. For a lot of us, we hate asking for it, right? And so, what do you do with that? Do you find somebody else who's really good at asking for it? Sure, you can try that. I think that's a valuable um, direction forward. But for some of us, the only person there is us, and so we have to learn how to do that. We have to sometimes bite the bullet and do what we have to do to see those dreams come to fruition. And then I think too, for me, additionally, it's how do I manage all these different buckets and make sure that things don't fall through the cracks? For me, I lean a lot on technology for that. Recognizing that I can't, um, I can't I can't have everything just swirling around in my brain, right? I need to have a way to know exactly what I need to work on today, be able to see my deadlines at a glance, because the progress of work in nonprofits and in faith-based communities is not always linear, right? Especially when you're dealing with the needs of specific communities. People have needs at different times. Those times are never convenient. And so you have to be able to both work on the fly, but also be able to um, work with certain deadlines and be very much administratively focused at the same time. And so, yeah, it can sometimes feel like a wild world. Whereas I would imagine being in a much more corporate environment, um, things are much more contained. Not to say that they're totally contained, but they're much more contained than they would be in a nonprofit and faith based space.
Well, the big difference obviously is, are you trying to make money, right? So
Yeah.
that's one of the key differences. One of the areas I like to talk about generally first, and then we'll explore this wonderful list of leadership challenges you mentioned, is this idea of time. On the
Mm,
last blog, we didn't spend a lot of time on it, except to say that leadership skills, leadership characteristics were driven by whether it's a short-term team or it's a long-term team. However, time is a really important element of leadership. In the case of
mm,
corporate environment, it's a measure of return, right? So, what am I getting for learning this leadership? What am I losing from not learning these leadership skills? Is a measure over time, right, of
mhm,
whether leadership's important or not. So, in some ways, in the nonprofit and the faith based, what I found in my 15 years of talking to them, they have a different perspective of time in kind of a disjointed way. Leaders in a nonprofit or faith-based organization look at time as if they have all the time in the world, right? That is, in the case of faith-based, God is in the world. This is going to be good. We're just part of this journey. We just need to let the spirit or whatever take over, and
mhm.
everything will be great. And at the
Yeah,
same time, they have the yearly budgets, they have the contributions. They have, can they keep the lights on? What
yeah,
should they do? In many cases, they have the bureaucracy, right? In the case of the nonprofits, they have the major donors' expectations, the grantors, the congregants' expectations. So,
mhm,
in a kind of a way, one of the biggest challenges in leadership, and whether you're going to invest in leadership skills or whether you have time to be a leader, is, what is the measure? At least in corporate, there's a measure. Either you're profitable or you're not. And if you're
mhm,
not profitable, some other leader's going to come in and they're going to take over. So, what makes you a successful leader in a church or a nonprofit oftentimes is your ability to set the vision, right? Or your
mhm,
depth of theology, right? um, Leaving you wondering whether leadership is skills are really worth having. And how do
true.
I do that, to your point? So, yeah, time is an interesting factor in the nonprofit and the faith based, much more than you would expect.
Yeah.
Um, Also, I've been involved with, we have, my group has a 6-week program. It's over 6 months, 9 months. You think that would be a no-brainer for churches, right? I mean, they've been here hundreds and thousands of years, right?
Yeah.
What the heck? And they feel God's eternal, right? So surely they can afford to be involved for 9 months. You'll not believe how often they drop out after 3 or 4 weeks, not because they haven't got a great deal out of it, but they've run out of time. They
Mm,
moved on to something else.
yes.
So part of the challenges of leadership is you have to, even in nonprofits and in churches, if you do not have a vision, and I don't mean a theological vision, that's obviously essential, or a purpose. I mean
Mhm,
a vision of what you're going to focus on and what
mhm,
it means to all of your leaders and your volunteers and your congregants in whichever case, then it's really challenging to move forward. It's almost impossible to develop leadership skills. You
mhm.
oftentimes use a charisma model, which we'll eventually get to, but the behavioral model really works with nonprofits and churches because volunteers, although there are a lot of problems with it, you talked about, and we can talk about those problems. The fact that you don't want to chase volunteers away, at least, though, if you present the checklist as moving the thing forward with a vision, and they can understand that, they feel they've done something.
Yes.
People want to feel like their time is valuable.
Yes.
So that's one of the big advantages of those checklists, even though there's a lot of challenges with it. If you can connect it with the purpose, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked in the Christian environment, I mean, those are all things that I think are important too. So,
Yeah.
what do you think about that?
I agree with that. I was so thinking about, from a faith-based perspective, thinking about this idea that, we are part of a church that was started before we got involved and that will continue after us makes it feel like you have a ton of time. But at the same time, I've noticed within myself and within other leaders that if you don't stay true to that vision and building towards that over time, it's very, very simple for another project, another idea, another need to kind of pull you away from that. And so it's very, very tricky, I think. But at the same time, I agree with the fact that when you're using that behavioral model, that behavioral theory model, um, you have an easier time with a situation where you have volunteers and leaders who come and go frequently, right? But because when one person goes, if you can if you're skilled enough to get another person to participate in that work, then you just hand them that same checklist. I think one thing that's really, really important in that is again going back to the fact that we're human, is how do we celebrate along the way? How do we keep the vision alive along the way? So constantly coming back to the vision and reminding people where we're going and why we're going there. Constantly reminding people the part that they have to play in that, right? And so yes, you are a volunteer who's capable, but also what is it specific about this particular volunteer? How does this particular person in their makeup, in their DNA, in their gifts, in their skills, and in the time that they can give to it, how is this specific person helping us move towards that vision and towards that goal? And then what are we celebrating along the way? How many people have we fed? How many people have we clothed? Because I think it's very easy to come back to the work and another week on another day and feel like, oh well, we've been doing this for the past few months. And I think as human beings, um uh, I think it's very easy for us to kind of stay in the now and forget where we've come from. And I think there's a um there's value, I believe, in celebrating the milestones, coming up with milestones along the way and celebrating those milestones. Because sometimes those milestones fall in the category of time, right? Sometimes it is a celebration that we've done this for a year, that we've done this for 5 years, that we've done this for 10 years. We can say that we've been uh, faithful, if you will, for an extended period of time. And this is the number of people that have benefited from our consistency and our faithfulness and our reliability over time. But I think celebrations are really, really important in that as well.
Yeah, I think celebrations really give you positive markers, right? So one of the aspects in my 15 years that I found is it's really important for nonprofits and for faith-based organizations that I work with to stay positive, stay focused on positive types of things. In the articles that we produce this month on the subject, appreciative inquiry comes up. It's a wonderful change model that focuses on a positive topic, goes through where you're at, where you're going, how to get there, what do you want to be. Very open ended questions, very positive. A tremendous tool for nonprofits and for faith-based organizations I'd invite you to take a look at, and we
Yeah.
can have some dialogue there. Because what I really want to mention here is uh, nonprofits and faith-based communities are not immune from society.
Hmm.
Society can be very divisive, and actually some of the most divisives are around, nonprofits and faith-based communities. Some of our biggest differences are there. So I think one of the challenges you run into is sometimes at least I found we dance around as leaders, not wanting to upset anybody,
Yeah.
not wanting to say the wrong thing, use the wrong phrase, alienate part of our group, lose our volunteers, lose our congregants. So one of the ways that I have found that's been very effective in some of the organizations I work with that are nonprofits and faith-based is you really start looking at what is positive, what is good, and then how are we fulfilling that good? How are we fulfilling that need? What do we want more of? Um, what do we hope for in the next 5 years? And then, probably most importantly, how do we get there? How do we make that vision real? It's just a very powerful tool. Every organization should be using it. A lot of corporations don't use it because they're focused on profits, so they tend to be narrow. My work in lean manufacturing, that was a very narrow why, where appreciative inquiry is how might, how could, how might. So it's still effective in corporations, I believe, appreciative inquiry, and we can talk about that, and we'll talk about that in future episodes.
Yeah.
It is particularly important, though, I think, in nonprofits and in faith-based communities to stay positive, to stay open, to think about the future, to celebrate, as you say, the milestones along the way. So, what are your thoughts on that, Jesse?
One of the things that I've noticed in faith-based spaces, and I would imagine also in nonprofit spaces as well, is this reluctance to rely on these statistical measures of growth, because what we're really trying to do is we're really trying to take care of people, right? We're really trying to see people as human beings. We don't want to see people as numbers on a spreadsheet. And so I think folks might hear that. And if you are one of those folks that hears that, I would say that it's not in that we are looking at those statistics alone. I think those statistics are a part, they tell a part of a larger story, and it helps you to tell your story, especially if your goal is to tell your story to someone who hasn't participated or been present with your nonprofit or your church. um, so for example, in the faith-based space, and especially in the United Methodist Church where I'm a pastor, we hear a lot of grumbling when it comes to the time of year of statistical reporting, right? We would love that every year we had an opportunity to show that there was more and more growth in our congregations, that there was more and more participation in small groups and things like that, that the giving went up and things of that nature. But life doesn't always work that way. As we mentioned, there's a lot of things happening in the background. And so sometimes those statistical reporting, especially when we're, again, trying to serve people, can feel like an interruption. It can feel like a burden. But it's something that is a part of an important part, I believe, an important part of what we do, in that they tell an important part of the story, not the whole story, not the only important part of the story, but it does tell an important part of the story. We joke here at my church about like the one person who's excited to see these numbers, right? Um, but even if it's just for that one person who's excited to see these numbers, I think it's important for us to do it so that we can. It's not so that we can pat ourselves on the back for a specific number at a specific time. It's so that we can track that number over time. And so even though we aren't like corporations that focus on how much money we're bringing in, how much money we're sending out. We do focus on that, just not, we don't just only focus on that. Um, all those numbers play a part and tell a story. But we actually need storytellers to participate in that story that's being told, to fill in the gaps and to give a more holistic picture of the story that we're trying to tell.
Well, I love you defending metrics. I used to hate metrics when I ran companies, particularly when it's part of the bureaucracy. So one of the things that's interesting in leadership that we can maybe write an article on or talk about more in the future, but I think directly goes to what we've been talking about here is how would you design appropriate metrics
Mm,
without bureaucracy? So
mhm,
eliminate all the bureaucracy. What do you really want to report? Because you're right, you want to celebrate, right? In order to celebrate, you have to know where you've been, where you're going, where you are, type of thing. So the first thing I always, when I work with some churches on this, first thing I try to do is pick your largest ministry. Okay, what's really important to you? Get that team together and go, how do you celebrate that? For
mm,
example, it might be meals for the poor, right? So we
mhm,
celebrated that we fed X amount of people. And then you go to the larger organization, in this case, a church it was that I was working with. Okay, so what does each of your ministries, each of your areas celebrate? And that's their metrics, right? That are still real, right? Because you're celebrating them. And then I work with the district office, the bureaucracy of the world, but you need bureaucracy sometimes if you're a large organization. And from there, I shared, okay, this is what your churches are saying, or a represented sample of your churches. What are you measuring?
mm,
Are you really gathering that data, both qualitative and quantitative? What does it mean? What kind of metrics do you have to change in this future time period? And how often is important too. Like a
mhm.
lot of the bureaucracy wants something once a year to justify. This is going to be Dave talking, justify its existence, right?
Yeah.
Yet you need the structure. So structure is important. Bureaucracy is always, by its definition, negative, right? Or should be eliminated, right? To make get the more direct purpose. So basically, that's how you build metrics. So I agree with you. You need metrics. The question is, in my mind, anyway, it should be built from the bottom up.
Mm,
Um, and we have a great podcast coming up in a couple months that talk exactly about that. So if you have
yeah,
some ideas in the community, let us know. But I
absolutely.
think one of the things that you're mentioning here too is you mentioned that I'd love to hear your thoughts on Jesse because I think it's so important. Is in nonprofits and faith-based communities, there's a common core of understanding, right? So at least you have a connection. Yet oftentimes there's big differences
Mm,
on the detail. And those
mm,
big differences of detail can be divisive.
mhm.
So, how do you think leadership should handle those potential divisive small things and yet focus on the bigger picture, right? Where whatever you're doing.
Yeah. So I think one of the things I think is important in that is that we need to recognize that as leaders, we also have uh, a part to play in that divisiveness. And what I mean that by that is that we fall into a camp, if you will. It's not always a binary. It's not always you're either you believe this or you believe that. But we also fall in a specific place on that spectrum when we're thinking about these details that can be divisive. And There's a lot of reasons why we fell into that camp, and we might be tempted to simplify it, but there's a lot of reasons why we fell into that camp, and there's a lot of reasons why folks fall into the camps that they do, that we might consider to be opposite to where we are. And I think we need to start with the fact that we're all humans and we're all diverse, and that we come to things from different perspectives. And, I think sometimes it gets really difficult. Sometimes we're just like, I cannot believe why a person would believe this. But as the leader, we don't get to sit in that, right? We can think that, but we don't get to sit in that. We do have to approach everyone, especially those who think differently than we do, on certain topics and on certain details. And we have to be very keen on understanding how they got there. And sometimes they don't even know how they got there. And so sometimes that's a situation, that's an opportunity for us to kind of explore that together, right? But we have to understand where folks are coming from, and hopefully we're also invited to share with folks where we're coming from. And I think once we do that, we get back to that shared human, um, that thing that we have, that's shared from a human perspective. And I think that we can at least agree on that. And I feel like if we can at least agree on that basic human need or desire, I think that we can find opportunities to be united, even though we aren't uniform on the things that we believe or not. And I think if you can communicate to your team, and to those in your community, that that's where things are really important. It's the places where we connect as human beings. If we can if we can get to a place where we believe that, and the folks that we are leading believe that as well, I think that we can have a lot more fruitful discussion, and a lot more fruitful practices from there. You might even find that you will move closer to where they will move closer to where you are. Although that's not necessarily the goal, um, you might find that that's something that will happen over time. But yeah, I think it should be expected. I mean, even in non-serious things, right? It should be expected that, like, I'm a big Marvel Comics fan, and then so and so is a big DC fan, but we can at least come to terms with the fact that we like our comic books for these specific tropes, and find some common ground there. But I think that's the important thing, is, as a leader, are you able to create space where you can find common ground? Now, there are some folks who don't want to engage in that, and that is not something that we can control. And I guess at that point, we would have to decide to how far are we willing to go in our journey with folks who are unwilling to have the conversation. Um, but I think, as from a leader's perspective, I think that is a space that we should be open to, providing, so that we can find some common ground to move forward.
Yeah, I really look forward to hearing from our listeners those interesting and amazing words. I do think you're absolutely right. Marvel's much better, and I really don't understand people that would think DC is better. However, beyond that, I think one of the biggest challenge that the corporate America in general doesn't have as much of is this idea of self-selection.
Mm, say
Because
more
in
about that.
corporations you have employment, right? You have
Mhm,
I'm either going to pay you or I'm not going to pay you. You can still voluntarily leave,
mhm,
but it's a paycheck, right?
mhm,
In nonprofits and in particular faith-based communities, it's easy for people to leave, right? They
mhm.
just leave. So oftentimes we see that there becomes unanimity. In other words, everybody believes the same thing,
Yes.
but it's a fraction of what could be. So I
Mhm,
think one of the interesting leadership skills here would be again, would be the ability to create space, which I think is one of the most powerful leadership skills. And hopefully, in some future podcasts, we'll be able to talk about that if it's
Yeah.
of interest to our listeners. Is because creating space is really interesting. It's the idea that you can create this middle, right? Where we can, whether we disagree strongly on some things, we can come together
Mhm.
and we could agree on other things. And a lot of theories talking about the ability to agree to disagree.
Mhm.
Appreciative inquiry talks about it really as finding a positive topic. You know,
Mhm.
what is our positive topic together, and how can we create that middle? So again, um, if you haven't, if you're part of a faith-based or a nonprofit, please look at the appreciative inquiry model in terms of what we discussed in our articles, but also in general, because it does create space. Uh, but there's a lot of ways you can do it. I loved your idea. A lot of times, though, I think the challenge with that, you tend to be isolated as a leader, right?
Mhm.
So if you're the only one that's trying to bring these two warring factions, which are usually a small amount on each side that are radical about it, right?
Yeah.
You're often seen as favoring one over the other.
Yep.
So what I would encourage there, Jesse and listeners who are pastors or do lead faith-based communities, is try to get a couple people with you. One
Mm.
that leans to the one side, one that leans to the other, and who are willing to stand with you.
Mm.
That works by far most effectively. It takes away some of the finger pointing and blame from the pastor that he's one side or the other. He's actually brought two people together. That a lot of the radicals, or the radicals in the sense of the outside, my way or the highway kind of people, they may not agree with it, but the majority will say, "Hey, these people are reasonable people." And they found a way to disagree and still participate. So if you model that kind of leadership, and bring on two other people, it can be extremely powerful. It can hold churches together. It can hold
Yeah.
organizations together that way.
Yeah, and I think to your point that the folks who are loudest, the folks who are radical and on the edges of the spectrum, it's not that many folks. There are much more folks who find themselves somewhere in the middle, who have a lot of thoughts sometimes, but aren't willing to actually speak up about it. Um, and I think a lot of times leaders, especially in faith-based spaces, are so afraid of those folks on the margins that they miss an opportunity to have a conversation with the folks who are in the much more in the middle. And yeah, I think it's important for us to remember that those folks are few and far in between. They just dominate the space, especially when you consider social media. They dominate the space on social media because that's the type of behavior that gets a lot more attention. That's the type of behavior that gets a lot more clicks. But there are a lot. I would say probably 1 in 10. I mean, for every one person who is loud enough to get on social media or to actually confront you about it, there are a lot more folks who are much more quiet about it,
No, I
who are interested in having the conversation, but won't get as loud about it.
yeah, I certainly appreciate that, understand that. One of the things that was striking me as you uh, were framing it way was the leaders today are faced with not only inside the organization but outside factors with social media.
Mm,
So people are being influenced by them, they're being influenced by them. So it's more than ever really important that the organization, whether it's a nonprofit or a faith-based community, has a culture, a leadership culture, a,
mhm,
corporate identity. So you could say, "Hey, our job here is to uh, feed the hungry, and secondarily, we want to get to know them, and here's how we're going to do it." So that when those people come together, when those voices on the outside, either inside the organization or outside, talk, there is an anchor, if you will, of
mm,
commonality. So again, commonality comes into play, and that commonality will um, really dictate what kind of leadership skills you need within that organization.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for joining the Theory to Thriving podcast. If you made it this far in the video, continue the conversation with us. You can join our free to join Discord, or you can just leave us a comment. We'll see you soon.